We will now call the April Ridgefield Planning Commission meeting to order. If everyone can please stand for the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And could we proceed with roll call, please, Ms. Siebert?
Commissioner Glavin. Commissioner Borkhardt.
Present. Present.
Vice Chair Flynn.
Present.
Commissioner Moylan.
Present.
Chair Tyler.
Present.
Commissioner Razak.
Present.
Commissioner Gordon.
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Lust, are there any late changes to the agenda?
No late changes, thank you.
Thank you. So now is then time for our first public comment period. Anyone requesting to speak to the commission may request to do so at this time on any matters that are not subject to a public hearing for today. If you have not provided notice in advance to speak during this public comment period, please use the raise hand feature, and the clerk will send you permission to unmute your microphone so you're able to make your comments. For controls over the phone, please press *9 to raise your hand or press *6 to mute and unmute. Is there anyone at this time wishing to make a public comment? Anyone in the audience wishing to do so? On Zoom? Not seeing anyone at this time, we will close the first public comment period and move on to the consent agenda. The only item is for the approval of the minutes from the March meeting. Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. We'll now move straight into our public hearing period, and I'll turn the time over to Ms. Lust.
Thank you, Chair Tyler. Good evening, commissioners, members of the public. This evening, we are once again going to be talking about critical areas ordinance updates. We have a presentation for you covering generally the same topics we've been through, major and minor proposed changes. And in your packet, as sort of a companion, you have for this meeting a summary document, sort of the horizontal matrix, can kind of be a reference as we talk through these things as well. So with that, and I guess just to note, the goal for this meeting is our presentation, hold a public hearing, and then we will be asking for any recommendations to council, as we do need to move this process on to council once we're done here. So with that in mind, I'll again introduce in person this time Eric Eisman, our consulting planner, who's been working on this update, and I'll pass it over to Eric to get us started on the presentation.
Thank you, Claire. It's a pleasure to be in front of you in person this evening. I apologize I wasn't here earlier, but things happen. But tonight, what I'd like to do is work through about a 21-slide PowerPoint. I'll tell you honestly, I went and put the first PowerPoint together that looked like this matrix, this table that Claire was just referencing. And after I did my first walkthrough, I said, oh my gosh, I fell asleep to my own voice. And so I changed it. I changed it around a little bit. And so this time I want to talk about, the way I've organized this is talk about themes. What are the big things that we're proposing that are different in this, and how do they fit together, as opposed to just looking line by line down the code. And then when we finish the 5 major themes, I'll introduce some other minor changes that are going on. Throughout the entire presentation, I hope I can keep your attention. I'll try to keep mine as well. And please ask questions as you come along. There's plenty of time for a dialogue at this level, and then of course during the public hearing. So when we go through the slides, I'll just say next slide please, and then off we go.
Yes, we can pause to figure out audio. Thanks.
Testing. I don't know why we're having audio problems today. Testing. Testing. Testing.
Thank you.
You don't need me to repeat that, do you? Okay, thank you. Good. All right, so again, last note on my first slide is please ask questions, all right? So let's go to the next slide if we would. So just as this one says GMA Central Directions, good. Very briefly, just to remind you that the Growth Management Act is driving this code update. Critical areas are part of the Growth Management Act regimen. Every roughly 8 to 10 years, we have to go through and revise this based on best available science. Our goals are always to protect the critical area resources. Our goals are also to make sure, and these are statutory goals, that we don't allow a net loss of function and values of these critical resources, state law. We have to support viable populations of animals, anadromous fish, and underpinning all of this is best available science. And that best available science are documents, guidance that's produced by the various state regulatory agencies after years of study, I suppose you could say. So that's where we start, and that's what we have to base our work on. So if we have the next slide, please. So the proposed amendments, the basis for these amendments that we've established so far in this public process is to have reviewed the checklist. We've done our best available science review. You've seen a memo from Kevin Gross on that earlier. We've done stakeholder interviews with agencies and with people who have expressed an interest in being part of the stakeholders. Their help driving the program so far. Comprehensive plan policies, the Shoreline Master Program, working in front of you. And then also, as a result of the last conversation we had, I've contacted engineering, I've contacted parks and gotten their feedback, and that's in the memo that sort of my recap of last meeting. And I apologize because I inadvertently gave Claire a draft of that memo. I subsequently revised it to make sure that I answered some of your questions more thoroughly, and it's now in front of you. So I apologize for that late addition there. Any questions so far? All right, thank you. In the record so far, we have to build a record for this here at the Planning Commission and also at the City Council and also through the work that we do. Because the Growth Management Board, if this ever goes to their level of review, they will ask the city to show the work and to show the record. And so that's the important part of what we're doing. Sometimes it might seem a bit redundant, but we are building a record for the city's regulations here. So again, these are just a list of the things that we've done so far in order to help build the record. One that's not on the list is the stakeholder interviews, and I've given you a summary of the conversations that we've had with them. And tonight's hearing will also be part of that record that we're going to be building. Next slide, please. So getting into the substance of this ordinance amendment, these are the changes that we are not proposing. We've gone through our literature review, stakeholder interviews, and so on and so forth, and density transfer, unauthorized alterations, frequent flooded areas, and appeals. We're not making any changes to those subsections of the code. The frequently flooded areas is a critical area that's required by law for us to evaluate. Here in the city and most other jurisdictions in the state of comparable size, you rely upon FEMA guidelines, and so there have been no changes in the last several years from their guidelines, so we're not going to change anything that's going on with this, with the frequently flooded. Next slide, please, if you would. So I warned you that I'm going to do this something in a thematic way, just so that we can kind of wrap our heads around how these changes maybe fit together. And those 5 major topics I want to talk about thematically, which you've kind of seen already in some of my work, is avoidance. That's something that's coming down from the agencies, from particularly ecology and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. They want the jurisdictions to emphasize avoidance of impacts of critical areas first. And so we're proposing some changes how to do that. buffers, if we do allow impacts to critical areas, and how do we also allow impacts to buffers, and how then do we mitigate that? The proposal that I'm making in this iteration of the code update is to follow one of your plan policies, environmental policy number 3, which says is to restore and to enhance your natural resources in the community. And so I picked up on that plan policy, and I'm encouraging in this series of iterations, our documents here, that we do some things to enhance the quality, function and quality of the natural resources. Mitigation, another thing that we're trying here in this ordinance is, in these proposals so far, rather I should say, is to, as part of the enhancement goal, is to bring some of the enhancement and mitigation back into the community where you benefit from it, and the wildlife and the fish and the fur and the muck all benefit locally from what's going on, as opposed to simply buying bank credits. For example, the wetland bank up at Farger Lake, 9.5 miles from here. So following your plan policies, we're trying to find a way to encourage more work here in the community. Third-party review, this came up in the stakeholders conferences, where at least one of the developers that we talked to would like for the city planning department, the community development director, to have a mechanism to resolve some disputes, if you will. It hasn't been tried very much in the critical areas world that I've discovered so far, but I'm always looking for ways that people can be flexible, work together, and find ways to mitigate problems rather than fighting against each other. And then finally, the critical aquifer recharge area, or CARA, went through a number of iterations with this, and finally just I'm recommending that we repeal it and replace it. And it's based upon some work that or research that I've done in other jurisdictions. One of the council members last time, commission members, suggested looking at Redmond's. I did do that, and they have a slightly different approach, but I've definitely studied that as well. Trying to simplify the CARA review process, because it's been a bit of a conundrum for staff sometimes. Next slide, please. Any questions, by the way? So I'm going to stop right there. I promised questions. Those are the themes. So now that's kind of what's coming. So avoidance is a scary word in a way, isn't it? The agencies, particularly Department of Fish and Wildlife and Ecology, are pushing the idea that the jurisdictions need to ask the development applicant to demonstrate how you have avoided impacts to critical areas before you automatically go into the mitigation sequence. And that's typically how things work. The project comes forward, staff reviews it for completeness, and then the consultant's reports basically talk about, well, we're going to impact these. We've tried not to hit them, but we're hitting them, and so we're going to go right into mitigation. So what we're proposing now is that in order to give a little bit of regulatory oversight into that concept of avoidance, is to start off by encouraging in the plan policies to focus on avoidance first, and then to demonstrate your work. Again, it's the whole idea of the Growth Management Board, show your work. And so we're just following that at the local level in the review process and say, tell us what you did in terms of avoidance first. And these items, I could go through them one by one, but these are the areas that we're proposing in the code that relate to avoidance. And most of them are the top 3, I should say, are driven by recommendations from the Department of Ecology and from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. One in particular that you'll see again later on is the second bullet point, which exempts functionally isolated wetlands of 4,000 square feet or less, with a lot of other criteria, from review process within your ordinance here. Right now the threshold is 5,000 square feet. Ecology is basically now saying, well, best available science says it's 4,000 square feet plus other issues, whether it's related to riparian areas, whether it's related to fish-bearing streams, size of it, hydrology. Those are their other factors. But the 4,000 square feet is the new threshold they're recommending. And so under the 4th bullet point, we're talking about approval criteria. So we're adding a requirement that the staff would have to evaluate the feasibility of their avoidance efforts. So the developer would come in, say, these are the steps I've taken to avoid. Staff then has to evaluate the feasibility. And I'm suggesting that some of the metrics for evaluating feasibility would be based upon project size, upon the type of the resource and the quality of the resources that are that are at risk, if you will, as well as the cost and the public interest. And so those are some metrics that we could look to decide whether it's feasible.
Can I interrupt right here?
Absolutely.
So the staff is going to evaluate feasibility, but what does that actually mean? What are the mechanics of what the staff is going to do? Is there a report that they would write? Do they have to, is it 2 out of 3 people have to sign off on it? How does that work?
I'll obviously defer to your community development director on whether it's 2 out of 3 or 4 out of 5. I don't know the answer to that. But what I would say is that what we would put into the ordinance and then into the administrative procedures are those kinds of metrics that I just talked about. And what we do already in the review process, and I've done a lot of reviews in this city and elsewhere, is we look at the consultants' reports and we evaluate the science, if you will, behind their report. When they come to their conclusions, what's the evidence to support the conclusion that they've avoided? And then from that, you make the evaluation. It's not a 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5. It's kind of an evaluation.
Yeah, I get that. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, these reports are presented and then the staff reads them and evaluates them, but then what? Is there a stamp that they put, like what actually happens? Who is responsible for approving something or not?
Sure. So ultimately depends on the type of project. Let's go with like a site plan as an example, though. A commercial project is usually a type 2 review process. So ultimately it is it's a staff level decision as to whether the project is approved and what the conditions of approval are. So in that case, it would be a staff level. The staff reviewing the project would be looking at this probably at the technically complete stage, making sure that that critical areas report that's been submitted is adequately showing that avoidance first occurred. And that whole review, it's like a first review basically, generates a written memo back to the applicant noting any things that need to be updated or any additional information that's required.
And then at the end of that process of sending the memo back during the technically complete review, that's a stage in the development review process where the staff will say, we need some more information about this, or you forgot to talk about that. When you get to the final decision, like the type 2 that Claire's talking about, the staff issues a notice of decision, final decision, notice of decision, which is appealable. When you go through a type 3 review in front of the hearings examiner, the staff writes a report, sends it to the hearings examiner with a recommendation, and then hearings examiner issues the final decision. So the procedures don't necessarily change in the code right now. I think it's been working well for the last 30 years.
Yeah, I guess the short answer to sum it up would be it would fit in our existing review procedures.
That's perfect. Yeah, I just want to make sure that it's not just something gets submitted and then we move to the next step. Someone's writing a memo saying yes or no, and there's an appeal process.
Yeah, fair enough. In fact, it's probably true that the critical areas reports, as well as the landscape reports and the architectural drawings, are probably reviewed very carefully by the staff. And there's almost always feedback going back and forth. The last 5 bullet points, most of those are there because of the Department of Health recommendations. The number 280-150C24, wetland buffer reduction, that's coming from ecology as well as also from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. What we're emphasizing is not whether the avoidance is possible, but whether it's feasible, and that's what I was talking about before, is that what are the metrics for determining feasibility, and that's something that staff I know will be working on. Any questions about this sort of general overview of this theme, avoidance? You can see it ripples through the code.
Not necessarily the general theme, but I guess more about when would be the appropriate time to offer questions on these, given the restructure of it. Is now the appropriate time to talk about this theme, or should we save our questions towards the end, or?
No, that's great.
Okay. Sweet. Well, I'm going to start asking my questions then. As it relates to the overall first point, that 18.2 280.010, the purpose section. I think it generally captures the intent, but one of the things that is not specifically mentioned in subsection E is, the ability to still work through offsite mitigation bank purchases, basically. Obviously, the first order of priority is to try to make those improvements within the jurisdiction boundaries, but it fails to mention that it is authorized within the language further down in the code. I'm wondering if it makes sense to merge D&E into a clear order of priority. I mean, that's sort of how you have this whole thing presented, right? It's like first avoidance, second on-site mitigation, third on-site city-owned controlled lands, and then fourth bank mitigation.
Exactly right.
And if you clearly outline that in the purpose statement, it sets the context for the rest of the entire ordinance, so that there's no ambiguity in terms of this is what we want. There's no question. If there's any slight askew language further in the document, you can always point back to that purpose statement and say, no, this is what we really intended.
I think that's an excellent suggestion.
And then 18.280.015, the definition of critical areas. I don't necessarily see it mentioned on this slide, but obviously plays into the overall concept of avoidance. Irrigation ditches are mentioned in here. It specifically says maintained or owned by a port district or irrigation district or company. Are all irrigation ditches controlled by an irrigation company or district?
No.
Would they still fall within the concept of this essentially exemption from critical areas? I mean,
I would say
feel like
that
there's a purpose behind this, right? It's delivering water from point A to point B, not necessarily. They're all man-made for the most part. Could it be better said that these are man-made channels specifically for the purpose of delivering water for irrigation?
without citing the statutory authority for the definition of a wetland, like not a wetland, but of a stream, it gets to that point, and it does exempt certain types of conveyances of water.
Right.
So are you suggesting we make that something up front, or just rely on it in the definition sections?
I would try to make sure that critical areas definition is consistent with the definition in state and federal law, which clearly exempts irrigation districts, or
Yes.
I mean irrigation canals.
Yes.
Not necessarily owned by an irrigation district, just irrigation canals in general.
So just to repeat what I hear you saying, make sure I get it correct, so that we want consistency throughout the document as to when we define all 5 of the different critical areas, so that they are consistent with state statute.
Yes.
Okay.
And this is because I personally ran into this issue before, where somebody misinterpreted something, where they said, "Oh, this doesn't explicitly say that this is exempt," and it's like, well, I can point to a million different things in state and federal law, but they still held me to going through a full wetlands and stream analysis, which was, kind of costly when it was only a small portion of the site that wasn't necessarily impacted. I have some more, but I'll let other people dive into questions. Nothing? Okay. All right, well, we'll talk about buffers later, right?
Yes,
Okay, so I can talk about measurements and questions on that.
yes.
Let's keep moving, and
All right.
then I'll come back to questions if I have any.
Okay. I would just close then on this section, on this page, then with the mitigation sequence. Again, we're discussing the feasibility of avoidance in there. We've added that, but the mitigation sequencing is the Department of Ecology's sequencing, which would be consistent with the state statutes as well. So if we can go to the next slide. Before, no more questions about this slide? We'll move on then, okay? And please, again, ask away. This is how we make it better. Critical areas, we're being asked to avoid critical areas, but we also have buffers as well. We establish the buffers for, the guidance comes from the agencies. We establish the buffers. The Corps of Engineers doesn't necessarily establish the buffers. So what we're trying to do here is that the key areas where we're going to find buffer issues are going to be in wetlands and in riparian areas of this ordinance, and then also in priority habitat species areas, fish and wildlife, section 280-110. That's where it's going to be, where we're going to run into the buffer problem. Department of Natural Resources doesn't really care much about buffers as it relates to landslides, and the Department of Health doesn't really care much about buffers as it relates to critical aquifer recharge areas, particularly wellhead zones of travel. So that's what we'd be focusing on when we're talking about buffers. So focus on the critical areas first, then focus on the buffers. Then we do the evaluation through the critical areas reports that come in as to whether the impacts that are proposed will result in a loss of function and value of the buffers as well. And the buffers have values because of their habitat value, because of their hydrology value. For example, those are the two big ones. Moving on, another major point that's in the buffer theme here is buffer reductions, and this came in from the agencies, in particular ecology. They do not like double dipping, if you will, where you can do a buffer reduction and a buffer averaging. A reduction takes 25 feet out of a 100-foot buffer. Buffer averaging says, well, we're going to take 25 here, add 25 there, and it's kind of a balloon, if you will. And so ecology is very strong about this one. Don't do both at the same time. And so we built that into this as well. And so what these bullet points are trying to do, referencing the different code sections, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are all coming from the Department of Ecology, with the exception of the second one, 18280-020A, that also comes forward from the Department of Health. And you'll see that throughout the ordinance. I didn't think we needed to go over each time, but Health says you cannot buffer impacts to drinking water. You just can't impact drinking water. There's no buffers to it. Moving down through this list here, 18280-110B 1 and 2, these are fish and wildlife buffers. And we've talked, when Kevin was here last time, we talked about the site-specific tree height, that 200 buffer. I know you had questions about that. I'm happy to entertain questions about that as well. What else am I going to say here about these? We are proposing in the code that we don't just that we adopt the site-specific tree height, that 200 best available science rule, but that we create an alternative. I'm always looking for alternatives that make sense. And that alternative is to rely upon the existing best available science that's in your code today. It was best available science 10 years ago. So we say we can rely on that, but what we're going to be asking for is enhancement, so that the reduced buffer gets improved to be equal to the functions and values of the larger site-specific tree height 200 buffer. Because at the site-specific 200 buffer, no one's required to do anything. You just lock it up. Blackberries, canary reeds, whatever it is, it just stays there. No improvements are made. And so what we're trying to build into this is, back to your comp plan policy again, is let's find a way to make it better for the goals and the purposes of the critical areas as well. So we're doing that here in this. Again, functionally isolated wetlands, come back into that. We talked just very briefly about buffer double dipping. Even though ecology disfavors buffer reduction, we're leaving it in the code. It's there already. But we are recognizing that they are limiting impacts or reductions of the buffers to no more than 25% of what the buffer is supposed to be according to the code. Okay. In the past, there have been more significant buffer reductions than that. And then we've added something new at the table, 18280-157, some strategies for how people can enhance or either reduce impacts wetland buffers or enhance the buffers as well. So I'll stop right there. Again, I'm giving you an overview and trying to show you how it ties together, and I'll stop for questions right now.
Oh, you go. I took up way too much time last time. Go ahead.
No, go for it.
All right. Well, first, compliments on the enhancement approach. I think that's a great way to balance trying to accommodate growth that's expected within our comp plan while also achieving our goals of enhancement on and protection of the environment. So kudos, it's great. And I think it's going to, the example you provided in the documents is a prime example of what can be achieved with enhancement. I do have some questions on the double dipping. My understanding is can't double dip on the same segment, but if it's a different segment of the same wetland or same stream, you could still do reduction and averaging. It just can't be just that same sliver of section.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I would add that when we did our stakeholder interviews and follow-up with the Department of Ecology, as Kevin would tell you, he was not sure that his approach to defining segments is something that they understood.
Okay.
But I think the way that you described it does make sense. A wetland is an amorphous,
amoeba, yeah.
amoeba, thank you, that's what I was looking for. And it has an east and a north and a south and other kinds of directions inside. A stream has reaches, linear lengths to it, and they have different qualities as you go up and down the stream on either side of the waterways. And so what we're trying to say is that we want to recognize what's on the ground and give the applicant the ability to make one a little bit more fungible, if you will, a little bit more malleable, but still not allowing the same reduction and average on that same segment. So I think you hit it right on target.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things that play into that, not just the shape of the wetland itself, but there's topography and how does that play into how a project gets laid out. You may have a big giant knob right next to it that by forcing this buffer to be done, now you've caused a bunch of excess grading, which you don't necessarily want too, because then you start having to cut down trees that you don't want to cut down. And so there's these unintended consequences just by saying you can't do any sort of buffering. And then the, buffer reductions and averaging. So the averaging, in my opinion, is great when combined with reductions to accommodate some sorts of, weird shapes and things like that. And so as long, I get the double dip on that same segment, I do like the ability that you can do it in the wetland overall as a whole. And then I do have some questions on the buffers themselves. And I think that it was the table 18.280.110-1B. When we're talking about the different types of streams, we have the type S, type F, type F, type NP and NS. When we get down to the NP and NS, we're talking about perennial or seasonal streams, right? So you got these ephemeral streams that most of the year don't contain water. And we have the high mass wasting potential at 100 feet and the low mass wasting potential at 50 feet. And I think my question was, I think there was a buffer of 25 feet somewhere, and now we're at 50 feet here for low mass wasting potential and perennial season streams. I'm not sure where I read the 25 feet. I'm just trying to.
Application of, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Application of pesticides and landscaping.
Got it. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out.
In Brewis.
Yeah, some consistency between buffers in terms of how it plays out. I was just trying to figure out the logic between the 50 to 100. To me, ephemeral streams are the same in my opinion, whether they're high mass wasting or low mass wasting. I'm not sure why we have two different buffers, but just curious about the logic. And then my main comment was, to your point, trying to make sure there's consistency between those various different things.
I think I understand. The table 1828110-1B is the existing code. I'm
Got
pretty
it.
sure it is. But we need to check that. We need to check that. And so that's the alternative that I'm proposing to the site-specific tree height buffers, which are larger than this. But we'll double check that 50 to make sure. So again, what I'm suggesting is that if it was best available science 10 years ago, it still has some legs, I think. And so we'll give you the opportunity to rely on that if you enhance, if you make it better. But I'll double check that 50 to make sure it wasn't 25. The 25 feet, that's coming from, with the pesticides, that's a standard that's coming from the Department of Health, not from the Department of Ecology, so that's why there's a disconnect between the two. We can make it the same. We can definitely do that if we'd like the consistency in the code, but two different agencies, two different approaches.
Right, but the
Correct.
stream.
Correct. Absolutely correct. And it's the drinking water, we're looking at the 1-year time zone of travel. And so that's a much more finite resource than the ephemeral streams are.
That part I get. But if you have an ephemeral stream, which it seems to imply that that's what this is talking about, versus drinking water, then I think it should be standardized.
Let me see if I can rephrase that to make sure I understand. In section 110, we're talking about fish and wildlife, and so we're talking about streams. And so the agency is recommending certain buffers to the streams without regard to what the Department of Health is talking about. And when the Department of Health is talking about is as it relates to drinking water and wellheads, not necessarily streams.
Personally, I'm fine with two different buffer or requirements. Distance requirements is a better term, not buffers, because one's a buffer, one has to do with application of pesticides. I'm fine with two for two different purposes. I guess that's where I stand. But
Now I can't find it.
I guess my main concern when it came to buffers on those is, I recall during the last hearing we discussed buffers not, ecology not, or frowning necessarily. Ecology frowned upon use of recreational amenities within buffers. And trails are such a huge priority for the city of Ridgefield. And I don't necessarily want to see trails eliminated from our clear corridors, which typically follow all kinds of different riparian habitats, which we have lots of if you look at our maps. We miss out on an opportunity to create that connectivity that we so desperately want.
I completely agree with you. I'm just showing my age. When I helped put together the first trail plan for the city in 1994, 95, we put it together to follow riparian areas and also potentially sewer lines. So I totally understand and am sympathetic to what you're saying. With that in mind, after the last meeting, there was a question about had we talked to Parks and Rec, and so I reached out to Corey directly. And his comment was not so much that the trails would be limited to the outer 25% of the buffer, but his comment was more that we may need to change the engineering standards as to locations and quality of materials, use of materials within the trail system.
And I did see that in the comments, and he said potentially unpaved, more social, non-social trails, single track trails were fine. And I think that still meets the intent, not necessarily what was probably originally envisioned with paved 10-foot wide trails. extending along there, but those are still achievable, and connectivity is still achievable within those buffer areas. It sounds like potentially.
I believe Corey thinks that they are, but
Okay.
I don't want to put words in his mouth.
Okay, yeah, that's something that I think is extremely important. The wider these buffers get, or we lose out on the opportunity to provide that critical trail connectivity. I want to make sure that that's something that is carefully examined.
Mr. Eisman?
Yes, sir.
So, please clarify something for me, please. 18.280.030, applicability and exemptions in critical areas.
Okay.
Number 5, landscape maintenance. Are you saying that number 5 only applies to drinking water?
Let me get to your 18.280.030, applicability and exemptions. Number
Landscape maintenance.
A applicability, A5, no person, company, agencies? Oh, B5, I'm sorry, my mistake. There we go. B5, landscape maintenance.
See, when I would read that, I could interpret it as both drinking water having applicability to drinking water or to streams.
No, you're correct. The first part of B5 relates to streams, and this should be probably made more clear. The second part came from Department of Health, and that relates to the well sources, water sources.
So that needs to be clarified.
Yeah, I can do that.
I do have a quick question on the enhancement of function for buffers. When that alternate strategy is elected, what do the execution and governance of that enhancement look like?
Do you want that one? Would you repeat that again? I was writing.
Sure, of course. So when the alternate strategy to enhance buffer function is elected, what do the execution and the governance of that enhancement look like? Who's involved? How do we look at what was ultimately done, whether what was done initially endures and achieves the enhancement that was sought?
Yeah, so we'd follow the same procedures we use currently for projects where some sort of enhancement is proposed as part of a mitigation plan. So first of all, there is a mitigation plan that's part of the application package that if the project is approved, that's one of the binding documents that is approved with it. Typically, a mitigation plan is required to have a monitoring scheme that's somewhere 7 to 10 years.
It's 7 to 10 years is what it is now.
And we require typically annual reports to be submitted to our department showing like what percent of species have survived. If that was below the expected threshold, here's what we did to replant them, things like that.
And regarding the monitoring, as Kevin mentioned, I think last time, in fact, one just came through just this week. Nowadays, agencies are also, the overseeing agencies are also giving the copies of the monitoring report. So the burden is no longer just on the city to make sure that the monitoring takes place.
Great, thank you both.
Shall I go on? Please? Okay. All right, mitigation.
I
Enhancement.
actually did have one quick question about the table that you referred to on the bottom of that last major theme, the 18.280.150-7, which I'm not on that page anymore, but let me get there real quick.
All right, that's wetlands, okay?
Yep. I was just trying to understand the language of it. Let me get there again. It's towards the end. Sorry, I'm almost there. There, okay. So change in water regime, which is down at the bottom of the page in that table. These are strategies for avoiding or reducing impacts. It says infiltrate or treat, quote, detain, and disperse into buffer new runoff from impervious surfaces and new lawns. And I guess I think I answered my own question, but I wanted to be clear. Why does it say new runoff and new lawns? Is that because it doesn't apply to existing developments?
Correct.
Okay. So we have that problem in existing developments. We can't do anything about it. Okay,
That's, yes,
thank you.
at least not in this ordinance.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm assuming there'll be another opportunity to ask questions about this table in the mitigation section.
We're getting there right now.
Perfect.
Okay. All right, so if you can't avoid and you're going to have impacts, then you have to mitigate. That's part of the mitigation sequencing from the agencies. We're encouraging that enhancement is part of the mitigation. And as we talked about earlier, we're trying to set up, and I think the idea of putting the protocol and the purpose section, I think, is a really good suggestion. I like that, to get information out up front. So what we're trying to do is set up a regiment, a flow, if you will. Try to mitigate on site first. If you can't do that, we'll mitigate in city-controlled properties. And I did reach out to Corey and to Brian about that as well. And then, if that doesn't work out, then go to the banks right away, as opposed to just going to the banks first. So that's the whole concept behind it. It's a fairly simple idea. And I can go through these points one by one, but if you've got a question, I think maybe we could move to that right away.
Yeah, just a question about that table.
Okay?
So, or more of a suggestion.
We're talking about table
Yeah,
18280-157?
Yep.
Okay, -7, thank you.
Light disturbance. It says direct lights away from the wetland. I think it should clearly state they should also be directed downward. I know that's something that the city is actively working on, trying for bird migration, dark skies. I think it's an easy solution for the way that lights are manufactured nowadays with LED.
And that would be consistent with the city's lighting ordinance, so
Yep.
yes.
Noise mitigation, just more of a question. How far should noise be from that riparian area? Is there like an acoustic analysis that would need to be submitted? Is there a decibel level that needs to be achieved at a specific boundary? To me, the clear and objective aspect of acoustics is really tough.
It's something that I've pondered about throughout my career.
Yes.
When I've hired subcontractors who are acoustical engineers, and they go out and they put their microphones in the field and
Yeah.
do their work.
Yeah. Is it a DBA? Is it a DBB? Is it a Z?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not dealing with that in this ordinance.
Okay.
The only time that the city, and correct me if I'm wrong, Claire, and that would be when there's an industrial project that's coming forward, we do look at reports relating to dust, glare, noise, and so if there's a concern in an industrial facility, then the city looks at it. In all of the residential projects, I can't remember a single one that was looking at noise. Do you?
Yeah, during a development review, our requirement is to look at noise impacts for industrial projects. Any other noise we're not really looking at during development review. We could, respond to complaints through a code enforcement process.
Yeah.
But it's mostly for development review, Title 18 world focused on industrial.
Yeah, in the municipal code, there is a nuisance section. I think it's chapter 5, if I'm not mistaken, and there are noise regulations in there. But but residential development, usually it's 55 dBA residential development for a sensitive receptor.
Yeah.
And that's daytime, 45 at night, and residential usually complies with that.
Oh yeah, for sure. Residential definitely complies with that, unless somebody's throwing a rager every single day.
I said DBH, DBA, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, and that seems pretty consistent with what most municipalities have for decibel levels. Okay, cool.
All right. Anything else about this? Major themes? Okay. I'm going to move on then.
Sorry, I do have,
Please.
one question regarding, it's just before that table, but it has to do with the city establishing a list of certified qualified professionals through appropriate annual advertisement. What does certified mean here?
When we, in this code, it probably should more accurately read qualified, because we define what a qualified professional is based on the discipline. And I think that's probably a good suggestion to make the terms clear and consistent.
Well, it says certified qualified right now, so.
Certified, all right, I'll be more careful here. That's coming from the Department of Natural Resources. They're very concerned that people who are looking at landslide hazards and slope stabilities not only are licensed in the state of Washington, but they have certain certifications from the state of Washington related to their engineering skills. That's why that word's there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Just there, I didn't see a definition of it. So I think Claire's probably heard me say something to this effect many, many times, but I'm concerned, not really, but I want to hear you say it into the microphone, about the appearance of the city having a preferred list of professionals who can do this kind of thing. So I know there's advertisement, there's a process for people getting on to some such list. That continues to this day, I believe, would be question one. And then question two, that will be the process for this as well. Is that correct?
The city doesn't maintain a list for development projects of who a developer may or may not want to hire. This is going to be based on the definition of a qualified professional, and if they meet that definition, then they're qualified.
So there is no list.
There's no list.
The city will establish a list of certified qualified professionals through appropriate annual. So the city will have a list.
It's existing code for wetlands.
I'm not aware that we have implemented that code with the list.
So I guess some editing and investigation maybe needs to be done before this goes to city council. But the main, whether or not there's like an actual list or it's just like the state list of people who are considered qualified or certified or both, I just want to make sure that there isn't sort of a backdoor relationship between the city and whomever is on a list, if a list does exist. And so I hope there will be some sort of proper procedure to make sure that anyone who is certified or qualified or both can appear on a list if it exists.
Understood and confirmed that if we are to move forward with that procedure of creating some sort of list, that it would be a fair and equitable process to be included on the list. As it stands, we do not, be it a certified biologist or any other person who could do work in the city, staff does not make recommendations. Folks do ask, so do you know of someone who could do this work? And we say we cannot recommend. So that's current practice.
That's been my experience as well with the city, but then I saw there was a list.
I think based on the definition of qualified professional, it seems fairly easy to clean that up before it goes to council.
I could propose that we just use this big X I just drew across it
Sounds good to me.
and delete it. One thing that I have seen in my professional practice is that particularly when you're dealing with wetlands, ecology and the Corps will sometimes question the credentials of the professional, but that's a different world. But so we can get rid of the list. I think that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to move on from mitigation/enhancement unless there's some more questions, and I appreciate these. So we're winding down the major themes. Critical aquifer recharge areas, again, we're proposing to replace and repeal the whole section here. Two forces that are driving it. One, you have to protect public drinking water. It's just not only common sense, but it's the law. It's nice when they work together. And two, we're trying to streamline the process and remove some of the inconsistencies in the way that the code is set up right now. People are having a difficult time understanding when a hydrology report is required and at what level the report is required. And so I was tying myself in knots trying to figure out how to make it more sense. And I just said, well, let's just start over again. We'll look at other jurisdictions, talk to the Department of Health. And then when they said the whole city is a sole source aquifer, the Troutdale Unconsolidated Sole Source Aquifer, everything by law is a CARA in the city of, sits on top of a CARA. Now, how you regulate them, how you designate them, and how you regulate them, that's up to the city. And so I thought, well, let's just try to streamline this, create some exemptions if you're in the low-level CARA, and particularly for residential use, unless it's a mixed-use project where there is commercial activity that's going on side by side with the residential use. There could be situations, particularly if you're close to a wellhead area, where you may need to go through some kind of additional review. But that's really the heart of what we're trying to do with the CARA program. And then at the very end, we've cleaned up a lot of the references to out-of-date wax and what have you. So questions? Whoever asked about the Redmond project or Redmond ordinance, I did look that up, read it, and they have 5 different levels of CARA designation. And I'd like to keep it simple.
That was me, and I like simple, so.
Okay. Any questions more about the CARAs? No? All right. Sir.
Yes, not specifically relative to the CARA, but underground injection well.
Yes.
So I guess the question is, apparently the city, or at least there's a list of UIC within the city limits.
Engineering, I think, has said they have 19 of them that they've identified.
At least that's what was in the draft. But it's also listed as a prohibited activity. Am I misunderstanding that?
Yeah, for class 1 through 4, UIC would be prohibited within the 1-year zone of travel of a wellhead. That's the way I'm trying to set it up. If
But the 19 that have been identified by Mr. Katz, we don't know what class they are. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. What I would say is that these regulations apply to new development or to development that is a substantial reworking of an existing facility. And so those 19 may not be subject to this ordinance because they've already been permitted by either the county or the city of Ridgefield. Very good. All right. Sir.
There's something that just talks about, the adverse impact. I'm just curious, what would be considered an adverse impact within that 1-year time of travel? I'm not sure I saw that outlined, but
Yeah, that's a
I'm
good
just
question. I like
curious
that.
more than anything.
Application of pesticides, hazardous materials not according to manufacturer's labeling, I think would probably be one of them. Or the illegal dumping, if you will, of hazardous materials within the zone of travel. That sometimes happens on private property. But again, the 1-year zone of travel is a fairly limited geographical area within the city of Ridgefield. We only have a couple of wellheads. 4, 5. Does that help you?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Do we allow ag wastewater to be applied to land?
I have been involved in that and permitted that in the past while consulting with the city because it followed the state statute related to the spread of agricultural waste on top of wastewater, thank you, on top of existing agricultural fields. So agriculture is a use that's, if you use the term grandfathered here in the city, and so I'm not aware if people are still doing that, but I do know that from past experience that when that happens, there are state requirements that they have to follow.
Can't do it during the wintertime.
Right.
During does that mean that if I'm farming ground and I've been allowed to apply it in the past, that I can still do it to my farmland? Or does that mean that I won't be able to do it if the council approves this ordinance?
Sorry, I'm just making sure I get my notes here. I think we're getting into the non-conforming use situation, so that if you have legal right to do it in the past, you'll continue to have the legal right to do it. I think every time you do apply in the future, you're still going to need the state you have to meet the state requirements. But I can see how that particular sentence, the way it's written right now, could locally prohibit something that the state might allow.
Yeah, it seems, to me, confusing. Maybe it's just me, but the way that I would read it is, it doesn't say to other people that it will hold practices. It says new application, so from year to year or whatever. That's how I would interpret it.
We can clarify that language to make it consistent with state requirements.
Great, okay. Thank you for that. This has all been helpful so far. So good. I'm going to move on to the last major theme before we get into minor changes, and that's third-party review. This was suggested by one of the stakeholder interviews by a private developer. And again, as we've said in the past, sometimes there's some disagreement amongst professionals as to the quality, the functions and values and classifications of particularly wetlands. And so this stakeholder was saying we need to have some certainty, we need to have some decision-making process, because if we just go back and forth with the agencies, it can take a long time. They don't operate on the same timelines that the city has to under law, under the Growth Management Act. So we came up with this suggestion where we could set up this mechanism to have third-party review. Now, there's a problem with it, which you've probably identified, and that is that it goes through third-party review. It's a qualified consultant that the city selects, the applicant pays for. The third-party professional, qualified professional, writes the report. Then it's up to the Community Development Department to make a determination. What that leaves out of the equation is the agency, the regulatory agency. And that's a risk. And the risk is that they may appeal the decision. They may agree with the decision of the Community Development Director, or they may appeal that decision to the Growth Board. But that's the risk. I don't believe in my world that the state agencies would allow the city to have jurisdiction over their rulemaking or their decision-making. But when I suggested it to the Department of Fish and Wildlife and also to Ecology, they were interested in the idea in an informal way. That's all I can tell you here.
I mean, they have to be a qualified professional, though, right? Certified qualified. sounds like a Beastie Boys song. I've had this with geotechnical engineers before in the past, where they just argue science at each other, and I felt like the dumbest person in the room. I found it highly effective, and I would hope that it would be seen that way by the state agencies, where you have two scientists arguing science, and that's what's being brought up, and it allows for robust science-based, fact-based conversations rather than, somebody like me, a layperson, that's going in trying to argue my point. So hopefully that's what I'd like to see out of the third-party review. It just brings a neutral person in that is solely concerned with the science aspect of it and reviewing within the context of the law.
And it would add to that a time frame for the review as well, so the dispute gets resolved.
It's a mediator, right? It's a professional mediator from a scientific background, right?
In a sense, correct me if I'm wrong, Claire, but if you've got an agency interpreting a wetland this way, and you've got a consultant interpreting it this way, and the third party comes in and says, well, this is what I think, the decision maker is really the Community Development Director. has the ability to, the third party is like a mediator but doesn't make the final, they'll make a call, but the decision is really up to the community development director.
It's just additional information to help support the final decision.
a
And
good
in
way to say it.
theory, it's not just the community development director, but it could be the hearing examiner too, right? I mean, either way, whoever that ultimate decision-making authority is, even, heck, even council if it gets appealed, right? Or
Doesn't go to
well, it
council.
doesn't go to council. Okay. Well, any appellant, right? You have that additional facts that help support and bolster an argument, which I don't think hurts any development application in the future, right? It just makes it that much stronger.
Is there going to be a list of these third party? No. Okay. I do have maybe a nitpick or maybe a little bit more than that regarding this idea of like best available science and having scientists, talking past the lay people. In that, certainly there can be disagreements based on, vocabulary words that I don't have when it comes to science. Earlier, we were talking about ecology has their standards and recommendations. Fish and Wildlife has their own. But there was a point where I think what you said was Fish and Wildlife have their new best available science, but we kind of like the 10 years ago version of that. And so if I'm misstating what you said, then I apologize, but that's what I think that you said. And I don't think that that's wrong necessarily. But when we characterize the situation as a bunch of scientists sitting in a room trying to figure out what is the best recommendation they can make to the development director, I don't think that's entirely accurate. We're sitting here talking about how we like this part of the best available science, but not that part. We like the 10 years version, not the 1 year version.
What I'm trying to do with the alternative is to give the developer, the applicant, if you will, the property owner, an option. And that option is to not just simply fall back on what it was, although we think that what was has been working for 10 years, but there's an addition to it, and that is you must enhance to the value of the new regulation. And so it's not necessarily that the old rules are better. We're merging the two, if you will, or at least creating an alternative that allows that to happen.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think the work that you've put in to this, the presentation, along with the actual work before the presentation to us, has been tremendous. And I think a lot of the ideas that we talked about earlier are tremendous. I just think that the phrasing best available science does not seem to line up with the reality. And I think the reality is what we actually want, where it's more than just the scientists, right? It's the developers, it's the city, it's the voters, it's everybody trying to put forward a plan that is feasible, not just based on what a committee of scientists said. That's not the only path for this. So I just think that phrasing maybe is I don't know, rub me the wrong way. It's a nitpick.
Can I take a stab at trying to defend your guys'
No.
approach to this?
You may not.
I think it's what you guys have done is you've taken the best available science from DOE, basically paints a broad brush stroke of, hey, this is what we suggest that you guys do. They don't, it doesn't explicitly prohibit us from trying to achieve the same objectives of, environmental preservation and ecological enhancement. Basically what we're saying is, hey, look, we can do these reductions and things like that as long as we're offering the enhancement to the same ultimate end condition that the buffer would have provided under the best available science. It has to be equal in order for that to be done, to be used. Otherwise, that reduction can't be done. You have to prove that you're enhancing to the same benefit of the best available science.
Based on your scientific knowledge.
Yes.
And that's where you get competing perspectives.
Based on the best available science, we're going to choose which parts of it we agree with, right? I mean, that's it. I mean, you just said exactly what I said, but you said it with a smile instead of a smirk and some criticism. Again, I'm not complaining about the work that has been put in here. I just think that phrasing is part of it, right? It's just part of it. So here's the best available science. We like 70% of it, but we're going to do these other things. And that's the way it has to be.
We have to follow best available science by statute.
What is the definition of that then? And we don't want to have this conversation tonight.
It's in the city code right now.
Okay. I mean, if we're merging the best available science with previous best available science and another department's best available science and our own opinions about things, and then at the end of all that, there's a list of third-party people, and then it goes to Claire, sorry, Ms. Lust, then it's not. It's not black and white.
I understand what you're saying, and it just made a little glimmer in the back of my brain here that said perhaps, since I mentioned that we do use the statutory definition of best available science in the code and have for quite a while, that perhaps we have a little addition to that allows us, in the definition of best available science, to do what I'm proposing that you do. Would that help? It still comes to the same result.
Yeah, again, I think the end product here that we're I guess not finished yet, but this is terrific. It really is. I don't know what the city code says as far as what is best available science and how that gets defined, but there's no definition of what that actually is, right? It might be in the city code, but because it's a merging of multiple opinions, multiple best availables, plus the intent of the city, it just cannot be that in reality. It cannot be best available in reality because it is a merging of different opinions.
There is in the definition at the end of the code of the draft, there is a definition for best available science. Do you want to see it?
No, we were just talking about that, yeah. But it still is up to interpretation what that actually means.
No, you're right.
So, and again, this is great. We're doing great, right? We're merging so many different entities and stakeholders. It's just that phrasing.
So let me just see if I can tie this up here. We're talking about third-party review. That's the context in which we're having this conversation, correct? When I look at what we're proposing as language that goes in the code, best available science is not mentioned. Does that help?
None of it's going to help. It doesn't make a difference in how I'm going to vote at the end of this.
Okay.
I just think we've come back to that phrase a bunch of times, and it appears that that phrase is, it feels meaningless. That's all.
Thank you for the comments.
I told you it was nitpicking.
All right, I'm going to move on, if that's all right. Question?
Well, I just also want to kind of question whether this is a true merging or, adapting to kind of picking pieces, because I thought part of what the new code has that was not emphasized in the other code, in the previous code, is the emphasis on avoidance. And that seems to me fundamentally different and important, and it is something we're agreeing on. We're not saying we're going to not take that from the state and from, I think that's what best available science is telling us, that avoidance is far better than trying to mitigate or enhance. And so I don't see it as being, I do see it as being new. Yes, we're trying to be flexible a little because we know our community and our environment and our development needs. And so maybe we're adding in these pieces of like the buffer changes and stuff. But to me, am I missing something? I mean, that's part of what I think is brand new here.
No, you're correct, and I don't think these statements are contradictory to one another.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to short circuit this presentation so that we can get into the hearing phase here. The next slide Other changes. The next half dozen or so slides are other changes. They're not part of the major theme, although they do relate in some ways to the major theme. And they're fairly straightforward, I hope. So I'm adding definitions based upon agency guidance, like, for example, the wellhead protection area. Department of Health has a definition of that. Avoidance is more of a Merriam-Webster definition than it is an ecology definition, just to be honest with you. I'm going to go to the next slide, unless you've got, but also, last session, someone asked why we wouldn't want to keep the definition section in 18280, and I propose that we keep that there as well as in 18100. So I'll go to the next slide unless there's questions. Purpose and procedures, other changes. This is, from my opinion, mainly housekeeping. And we're clarifying that the land under our jurisdiction is only the city limits. We're defining the 5 critical areas according to the state statute. We're establishing no net loss again in the policy, but clarifying that it doesn't apply to wellheads. The Department of Health is particularly anxious about that. Very simple, straightforward kind of clarifications. Unless there's questions, I'll go on to the next section. This one might produce some comment. I shouldn't have jinxed that. In the existing code right now, 18280-020B, there's a little bit of some confusion that WDFW had as to what code section applies or governs. In the shorelines, it's clear in the Shorelines Master Program that the Shorelines Code governs. And it was also, they asked us to clarify that when we're dealing with critical areas and there's a conflict with another section of the code not in the critical areas code, that we make it clear that critical areas code governs impacts to critical areas, not landscaping codes. Regulatory flexibility, this is something that's 2 agencies suggested that we get rid of because, I hate to use the phrase, but because it would be inconsistent with BAS, okay? Because it gives the property owner to opt out without a scientific basis from the regulatory scheme here. So they've asked us to take that out, and we've also run across this in our own development review here in town, where it's been a problem in reviewing projects. It's been contentious sometimes. I'm going to move on unless there's questions. Next slide, please. Exemptions. First exemption, again, this is the buffer question. This is a chemical question. Prohibited from 25, we're changing it to 50 feet based upon health. That was that 25 foot we talked about before. Something that came out through the stakeholders, also from the recreation, community center recreation application. Right now, you have to use handheld equipment to remove invasive species. Industry standard is to use handheld mechanical means in order to bush hogs and things like that to get rid of invasives. So we're making that clear that you can do that without a permit, or at least in keeping with your critical areas permit. And then back to the wellheads again, the 50-foot fungicides and herbicides within wellhead protections area has to be licensed to do that.
Question, can we go back to 14, please? The end of
14.
Yes, so the very last line, last word, acceptable. Wouldn't it be better to say in lieu of acceptable, allowed?
It does not apply to wellhead protections areas because adverse to impacts to potable water are not.
Wouldn't it be better to say adverse impacts to potable drinking water are not allowed?
Yes, I think in the code I use the word prohibited.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yep, very good. I'm going to move on to approval process, other changes. Again, quite a few of these come from agencies. As you can see, the Department of Health is in there. Wellheads, anything that deals with wellheads is coming from the Department of Health, including the 5-foot structure setback. 2 things that are new that came out of the stakeholder comments. F3 under 18280-040 F3. This provides the Community Development Director with some more flexibility as to decide where the markers should be placed along critical area buffers, as opposed to a hard and fast rule. Hard and fast rule is X number of feet. Well, it doesn't take into consideration the landscape that's there. And then JIB, this came from two different agencies. Best practices seem to be in jurisdictions increasing the financial security up to 125%. Mr. Cass didn't have an objection to that. Other minor changes in the next slide. Again, these are fairly housekeeping. Anything, again, you see from drinking water is coming from Department of Health. C 18280-090, reasonable use and public utilities exemptions. Health does not believe that public utilities should be exempt from the prohibition of contaminating drinking water, and makes sense. So these are, and what we did for the first one under 18280-080A, minor exemption is governed by 18350. That's your standard adjustments and variance procedures. So we're just clarifying what the procedure is. Geologic hazards on the next slide. DNR didn't have a lot to say. They said that our ordinance was better than some, and not as bad as others, which I took as a compliment. But the substantive issues there were we needed to add the word landslide and define landslides because there are landslide hazards in the area. Also, they were very concerned that we make sure that the geologist is licensed in the state of Washington, not just an engineer licensed in Washington. They also were very concerned that the analysis that the geotech report also has to consider public safety because it currently doesn't. All right.
Roads and landslide and bank erosion hazard. This is listed on the geologic hazard area.
Parts of it do, yes. In fact, well, I'm familiar with a situation where as you're coming down the hill towards G Creek, there were some slumps that happened several years back, and there were some emergency repairs, so there's landslide hazards in that area in particular. Also in the Bertsinger, is it Riemann Road area? It's landslide hazard potentials in that area as well. That's it for the slides, except for next steps. And the next steps is after the hearing tonight, we'll take whatever recommendations you make. We will incorporate them into the document. I'll write a report for the council based upon this hearing as well. And then we will send the package off to the Department of Commerce for the mandatory 60-day review. And then we'll move on to the council, and you don't have to listen to this. I get flippant sometimes. I should apologize. It's just who I am. That's the end of my presentation. Unless there are other questions, I can help you with.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Eisman. Maybe at this time we can go to public hearing, and then we can come back, and if any of the commissioners have any questions, follow-up questions, we can go to that. So now is the time for public hearing on this item. If you have signed up with the clerk prior to the meeting to address the Planning Commission, your name will be called, and the clerk will send you permission to unmute your microphone or come forward to the podium to make your comments. If you have not provided notice in advance to speak during the public hearing, please use the raise hand feature if you're on the Zoom. If you wish to make your comment, and the clerk will send you permission to unmute your microphone so you're able to do so. For controls over the phone, press *9 for raise hand and press *6 to mute and unmute. Please state your name and limit comments to 3 minutes. And as a reminder, there will be no back and forth interaction between the speaker and the Planning Commission. Did anyone sign up prior to the meeting to speak during this hearing? Public hearing? Does not appear so. Anyone wishing to make a comment during this public hearing at this time, if you may come forward to the podium and again, state your name, and you have 3 minutes.
Hi, my name is Jean Stemp. I'm Vice President with Friends of the Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge. And I just wanted to thank everybody for all the work they have put into this. I'm actually pleased to see some of a lot of the things that have come up in here. And thank you for mentioning the birds. I do appreciate that. And I just want to say that, you know, so many people don't understand that the refuge is not a zoo. It's, you know, the wildlife comes and goes, and everything we do here in Ridgefield impacts what happens with that wildlife. And so I really appreciate the work that everybody here is doing to make sure that the habitats and everybody, all the animals who use them, are safe. And as far as what was talked about here today, the only thing I have to say is I do have concerns about the feasibility metrics. I hope that those are very carefully thought out, because, you know, it could be, you know, oh, I want to put a 200 house development here, but because of this I can't, so it's not feasible. It's like, well, it is. You're just not going to make as much money because you have to put in 150 houses instead of 200. So, you know, just things along that line. But that's all I have to say, so thank you for listening.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to make a comment during the public hearing? Anyone on Zoom? Not seeing any other comments. We'll close the public hearing for this item and proceed back. Any commissioners have any questions, further questions for Mr. Eisman or Ms. Lust?
I just have a, if I may.
I had a question. It may be a dumb question, but I'm new to the Planning Commission, so I get to ask these things. When you made a comment towards the end there, Eric, I think, about how these critical area ordinances only apply within city limits and not within the urban growth boundaries. But the city is developing within the urban growth boundary, and the city takes and just makes decisions about developments within the urban growth boundaries, and this ordinance would not affect those?
Development in the UGA is still under Clark County jurisdiction.
Okay. Okay.
Properties, if they're in the UGA and then annex into the city, then subsequently they're under our jurisdiction, and this would apply.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Any other thoughts or comments or questions? Please.
This is a long one. Sorry, everyone. No, I want to echo just how impressive this packet is. I don't think we've ever had anything like this before with this combination of thoughtful and the depth of the answers on some of these, also bringing in so many different people who are involved, getting their answers and then putting it all together for us. Really just, this is a big topic, and preparing for tonight, I don't think it would have been possible without that document. So thank you. I do have one question that's maybe better for Ms. Lust, and then a comment that I don't think anybody's gonna like, so get ready. So on page 7, there is a response. Well, the question is, the response
Commissioner
is,
Flynn, what document are
yeah, page 7 of the
the
of the
memo?
notes.
Consultant's memo?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So page 7, quarter of the way down, it says, let's see, third-party review. Could the city establish an internal cap on how large the third-party fees can be? And the response is yes, the city could establish a fee cap as an administrative policy rather than establish a fee cap within the RDC. I'm just curious, is that because it's just easier to change?
You're correct. We avoid putting fees in code. We keep them in the fee schedule.
Yep, okay, sounds good. And then later on that page, this is, maybe this is just nitpicky a little bit too much, but It says, comment and adoption, explain the 60-day formal comment period and final city council adoption. So then the response is, after Planning Commission's April 1st public hearing, that's tonight, the commission will make a formal recommendation to the city council regarding the amendments. Staff will adjust the proposed amendments accordingly and will send a copy to the Department of Commerce for the mandatory 60-day comment period. The nitpicky thing here is that I just think the phrasing is a little bit shaky as far as staff will adjust the proposed amendments accordingly. I think that it's not clear what it is according to. And I think that we probably all recognize that it has to do with tonight and what the Planning Commission recommends. But I'm very uncomfortable with the city staff just making edits or changes. Not that they wouldn't do a better job than I would. Of course they would, right? But the role of this commission is to make recommendations, and then the staff makes the adjustments based on those recommendations. I just think that that sentence is not entirely clear. And in a situation like this, where we are going to make a bunch of recommendations tonight, and you've made handwritten edits, and then you're going to put in the real edits, we want to be precise in some of these phrases, and I think that that's my nitpick.
We can rephrase that so it's clear in the record.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions or otherwise? Not seeing anything. Do we have I'd ask for a motion on this item.
I'm trying to come up with one.
Suggestion?
I think we're pretty time critical here. Is that correct, Ms. Lust?
That's correct.
So I think what we're going to end up having to do is someone's going to make a motion to recommend approval as presented with the adjustments that have been written down. And I think that's what the motion's going to have to be.
And the adjustments have also been captured in the record of this meeting.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct. I do make a motion.
Yes. Do we have a formal motion?
I'll make a motion, and I will motion that we adopt the ordinance with the make a recommendation. You're right. Thank you for the clarification. Make a recommendation that council adopt with suggested edits that were reflected on the record, including but not limited to adjusting the purpose statement to be more reflective of the order of priority, clarifying irrigation districts to be consistent with state law and federal law, mitigation clarification for light to be downward facing. And I think that captured most of my comments. If anyone wants to append that and add more, I'm willing to hear that before I make that formal motion, or they can do it with their second. I'm just trying to add clarity for
But you can
record
make
purposes.
Right. You can make a motion, and then somebody can second it, and then we could discuss it. And if somebody wants to move to amend that motion, I guess is the proper procedural rules.
That is correct.
And then that is my motion.
Do we have a second?
Seconded.
So we have a motion and a second. Is there anybody discussion on the motion that anyone would like to make or have, or?
If I can ask the question to the members of the commission, does anyone have a concern that your comments may not be accurately reflected in the code revision? Because if we do not, then we can just proceed with the vote, as I see it. Would that make sense? But if we do have concerns, I think now is the time to bring it up or amend it. Amend the motion.
I do not have concerns. I think that our concerns have been weighed over the last 90 minutes or so, and I think accurate notes have been taken, but also it is part of the record, and so I have no concerns that that any of my positions are not going to be at least included or considered.
Any other thoughts or comments on discussing the motion that's been made? Okay. And this time I will call for a vote. All in favor of approving the motion, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time and preparation. It's been very, very helpful. We will kind of move forward to close up this meeting. So now is the time for our second public comment period. Anyone requesting to speak to the commission may do so at this time. If you have not provided notice in advance to speak during the public comment period, please use the raise hand feature, and the clerk will send you permission to unmute your microphone so you're able to make your comments. For controls over the phone, press *9 for raise hand and press *6 to mute and unmute. Is there anybody in the audience or on Zoom wishing to make a comment at this time? Not seeing anyone, we will close the second public comment period. We will proceed now to staff reports. I'll turn the time back over to Ms. Lest.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commission, for your time this evening. Really appreciate your input and engagement with the material. It's very helpful. I was going to make a joke about that all being like an April Fool's prank, but I'm too tired, so I don't know. I do not have any more announcements this evening, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. We can go to any reports from the commissioners and start at this end this time, if you don't mind.
I don't think anything for me. I similarly considered saying something ridiculous and absurd to grind us to a halt for a second, but being so new to the commission, I decided against it, perhaps next year.
Thank you, Commissioner Glevin.
Nothing for me. Thanks for putting everything together.
Vice Chair Flynn.
Yep, thanks for doing such a great job. This was a wonderful discussion and wouldn't have been possible without all the preparation work that was put into it. So thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Borchardt.
Yeah, echo that statement. The stakeholder outreach was incredible and appreciate that. Also, just wanted to say we tabled at the State of the City, and that was just a great event. It was great to spend time with some of our neighbors, talking about what the Planning Commission does and everything that's coming down the pipe. My wife also attended the volunteer fair that was here, and it was like popping. There was tons of people that were looking to get involved, so that's great. Hope more people in the community continue to get involved and show up and do great things for our community. So that's it.
Thank you. Commissioner Ward.
I also just want to say thank you so much for all the work that was done and how thorough this was, and I felt like there was a lot of effort to help us to lead us through a complicated set of statutes. So thank you.
Thank you. And Commissioner Moylan.
My wife and I attended the State of the City, and I cannot recall being more impressed with a city than this one. I mean, we came from outside of Chicago, so, large suburb. And the leadership that's demonstrated by the departments, by the mayor, by the city manager, by the council, it was just fascinating, and it just blew my wife and I, it blew us away, right? Where this city is going, and I'm very, very proud to not only be a commissioner, but to be, more importantly, a resident of this very fine community.
Thank you. And I'll just echo my thanks to Mr. Eisman for all the preparation and assistance in getting us a very, very, not only quantity of information, but high quality as well. And so I just want to thank you for that. And as always, thank you to Ms. Lust and everyone, and Ms. Siebert, and thank you for the audience. Members of the public, always happy to see people actually in the chairs, so it's always great. And so thank you for being here. I don't have anything else to add, and so unless there's anything else, I believe at this time we will adjourn.